Go ahead, tell them what you used to do, Daniel. My wife said, swirling her champagne like she was hosting the night instead of just attending it, her voice light, playful, and just loud enough to cut through the soft jazz and low conversation in the room. And then she laughed, that polished laugh I used to admire. But tonight it sounded different, sharper, almost toxic, and every head at that $208 plate dinner table turned toward me like I was the punchline waiting to land. And I could feel it, that shift in the air, the kind that only happens when respect quietly leaves the room and something uglier takes its place. But I didn't move. I didn't even tighten my grip on the glass in my hand. I just leaned back slightly in my chair and let her keep talking because I knew something she didn't, something none of them did. And sometimes the most powerful move a man can make is to stay silent, while everyone else builds the moment that's about to break them. He used to work in a garage. Emily continued, smiling wider now as a few of her coworkers leaned in, curiosity turning into amusement. Like, literally fixing engines all day, grease, oil, the whole thing. A couple of them chuckled, one guy actually shook his head like he couldn't imagine it, and Emily didn't stop there. She never does when she finds an audience. I mean, can you imagine going from that to, well, to this? She gestured around the room, the crystal glasses, the tailored suits, the skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows like money itself was humming outside, and that's when the laughter really picked up, not loud, not cruel on the surface, but enough to make the point, enough to let me know exactly where I stood in their version of the story, the broke husband, the background piece, the man who somehow got lucky marrying up. And I could feel eyes on me, measuring, judging, deciding who I was based on the version she just handed them, and right then, something inside me went very still, not anger, not even hurt, just clarity, the kind that comes when betrayal doesn't shock you anymore, it just confirms what you've been quietly noticing for a long time. Emily leaned closer to her boss, a man named Victor Langley who wore confidence like it was part of his suit, and she added, softer but still audible, I had to push him to aim higher, you know? Some people just get comfortable. More laughter, a few nods, and I saw it, that subtle shift where they weren't just laughing with her anymore, they were agreeing with her, buying into the narrative that I was something she had outgrown, and I let it all play out, every word, every look, every small betrayal stacking on top of the last because timing matters, and truth, real truth, hits harder when it lands at the exact moment people feel most certain they understand you. I took a slow sip of my drink, set the glass down with a quiet click against the table, and finally looked up, meeting each of their eyes one by one, not rushing, not forcing anything, just letting the silence stretch long enough to make them aware of it, because silence, used right, is louder than any comeback, and in that pause, in that thin, fragile space between their laughter and whatever came next, I knew this was the moment everything was about to change. Not because I was going to raise my voice or make a scene, but because I was about to let the truth do what it always does when it's been underestimated for too long. I leaned forward just slightly, my voice calm, steady, almost conversational as I said, yeah, I did work in a garage. And I watched her smile hold, confident, certain, completely unprepared for what came after. The one this company was built on. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, like something fragile that no one wanted to touch first, and for a second, nobody laughed, nobody moved, it was just the soft hum of the city outside and the faint clink of glass somewhere across the room, and then Victor blinked, slow, confused, like he was trying to process a sentence that did not fit the version of reality he had already accepted. I am sorry, what do you mean? He asked, his tone polite but tighter now, and Emily let out a small laugh beside him, the kind people use when they think something awkward just needs to be brushed off. Daniel, come on, she said, placing a light hand on my arm like she was managing a situation instead of being part of it. Do not make this weird. But I did not look at her, not yet, because this was not about convincing her anymore. This was about letting everyone else see what had been sitting in front of them the entire time. I mean exactly what I said, I replied, calm, steady, the same tone I had used all night, the same tone they had mistaken for weakness. That garage you are laughing about, the one with the oil stains and broken lifts, that is where the first prototypes were built. That is where the contract started. That is where this entire company began. I could see it now, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the way a few people straightened in their chairs, the way one of the older executives narrowed his eyes like he was replaying something in his head, trying to connect pieces he had ignored before. Emily's smile faltered just slightly, just enough to reveal the crack underneath. "Daniel," she said. Again, quieter this time, her voice no longer playful. "What are you talking about?" And for the first time that night, I turned to look at her fully, really look, not at the polished version she showed the world, but at the person who had just spent the last 10 minutes turning me into a joke, and I realized something that felt colder than anger. This was not just disrespect, it was betrayal, the kind that grows slowly, quietly, until it shows itself in moments like this. "You never asked?" I said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, and that landed harder than anything else I could have said, because the truth is simple, and simple truths are the hardest to defend against. And around us, the room was no longer laughing, it was watching. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer empty, it was heavy, loaded with questions no one wanted to ask out loud, and I could see it spreading across the table like a slow realization, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the words. Victor shifted in his seat, his confidence no longer effortless, his fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass as he looked at me again, this time not as a joke. Not as background noise, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "You are saying you built the foundation?" he asked carefully, and there it was, the first crack in the narrative, not disbelief, but curiosity, the kind that pulls people in whether they want it or not. I gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough. "I am saying the first contracts, the first designs, the early partnerships, they did not come from a boardroom," I said, my voice even, measured. "They came from a place most of you would never step into, a place you just laughed at." And I let that sit, let it settle into the room, because truth does not need to be loud to be undeniable. Emily's hand slipped off my arm without her realizing it, her posture changing just slightly as she tried to read the room. But the room was no longer hers to control, not anymore. One of the older men at the far end of the table leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What was the name of that garage?" he asked, and that question, simple as it was, shifted everything, because now this was not a joke anymore, this was verification. I met his gaze and answered without hesitation, and the moment the name left my mouth, I saw it, recognition, real, immediate, the kind that does not need explanation. His expression changed, subtle but undeniable, and he leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose like he had just connected something important. "That facility was acquired in the early expansion phase," he said, more to himself than anyone else, and now the energy in the room turned completely, heads angled differently, eyes sharper, conversations dying before they even started. Emily looked at him, then at me, then back again, her smile gone now, replaced with something uncertain, something searching. "Daniel, what is going on?" she asked, her voice lower, no longer performing, and I could hear it, that shift from control to confusion, from certainty to doubt, and that was the moment I had been waiting for, not to embarrass her, not to win an argument, but to let reality catch up to the version she had been selling. "What is going on?" I repeated quietly, as if considering the question. "Is that you told a story tonight?" I continued, finally turning my body slightly toward her. "And everyone believed it because it was easy, because it fit what they saw." I glanced around the table briefly, meeting a few eyes that quickly looked away. "But the problem with easy stories is they usually ignore the parts that actually matter." I leaned back again, relaxed, composed, not a trace of urgency in my tone, because I did not need it. The room was already leaning in, already waiting. "That garage you joked about," I said, my voice steady as steel, "is where this company's first $1 million was made, before there were investors, before there were offices, before any of this." I gestured lightly around the room, the polished surfaces, the curated success. "And the man who signed those first contracts." I paused, not for effect, but because the weight of truth deserves its own space. "Was me." And this time, there was no laughter, no polite smiles, no dismissive glances, just silence, complete and undeniable. The kind that only shows up when karma starts to unfold in real time. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured, slowly, unevenly, like something carefully built coming apart under its own weight, and I watched it happen in real time, the way people shifted in their seats, the way a few of them avoided looking at Emily now, not out of loyalty, but out of discomfort, because the story had changed and no one wanted to be standing on the wrong side of it. Victor cleared his throat. Subtle but forced, his earlier confidence now replaced with something more cautious. "Why has this never come up before?" he asked, and it was a fair question, the kind that sounds simple but carries more underneath it. I gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just honest. "Because it did not need to," I said. "I stepped away years ago, built the structure, handed over operations, let other people take it forward." I paused briefly, letting that land. I was never interested in being the face, only the foundation. And that word lingered longer than the rest, foundation. Because suddenly everyone understood exactly what Emily had been mocking, and why it mattered. She stood very still beside me, her expression no longer composed, her eyes searching my face like she was trying to find the version of me she thought she knew. "You never told me that," she said quietly, and there was no accusation in her voice now, only disbelief, and that hit differently, softer, but heavier. "No," I replied, meeting her gaze without raising my voice. "I did not." And for a moment neither of us said anything else, because the truth had already done its work. It does not need decoration. Around us, the room had completely shifted. The same people who had been laughing minutes ago were now silent, attentive, recalibrating everything they thought they understood, and I could feel it, that turning point, the exact second where respect returns, not because you demand it, but because reality leaves no other option. I reached for my glass again, calm, steady, and took a small sip, letting the quiet settle fully before I spoke one more time. Not to impress, not to argue, but to make one thing clear, the problem was never the job, I said, my voice even, controlled. It was the assumption behind it. And this time, no one laughed, not even a little. Emily inhaled like she was about to say something, then stopped, her lips parting slightly before closing again, and that hesitation told me more than any words could have, because for the first time that night, she was not controlling the room, she was reacting to it, and that shift was impossible to hide. Victor glanced at her briefly, then back at me, recalculating, not emotionally, but strategically. The way people do when they realize power in the room has quietly changed hands. "So you founded the early operation," he said, choosing his words carefully now, and I nodded once. "And retained equity," he added, more as a statement than a question, and I met his gaze steady. "Enough," I replied, and that single word carried weight, more than numbers ever could, because people like him understand what enough means when it is said that way. Around us, a few of the executives exchanged quick looks, subtle but loaded, the kind of silent communication that happens when reputations are being reassessed in real time. Emily shifted her stance, her shoulders tightening slightly, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, stripped of the confidence she wore so easily before. "Why would you let me say all of that?" she asked, and there it was, not anger, not denial, but confusion, and underneath it, something else, something closer to realization. I looked at her for a moment, not with resentment, not even disappointment, just clarity. "Because I wanted to hear it," I said, and I meant that, every word, every laugh. Every glance from the people around us, it mattered, not for them, but for me, because there is a difference between suspicion and certainty, and tonight had erased that difference completely. I leaned back slightly in my chair, calm, composed. "People reveal themselves when they think there are no consequences," I continued, my voice even, measured. "And you did exactly that." The words were not harsh, but they landed harder because of it, because truth does not need volume to cut through illusion. Emily looked down for a brief second, then back up, but the version of her that had laughed minutes ago was gone now, replaced by someone trying to understand how quickly everything had shifted, and around us, the room stayed quiet, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to interrupt what had become something far more than a simple dinner conversation. It had turned into a moment. The kind people remember long after the night ends, and I could feel it settling in, the weight of it, the start of something that would not be undone with a joke or a smile. The room did not return to normal. It shifted into something quieter, more careful, like everyone was suddenly aware that every word carried weight now, and I could see it in the way people held themselves straighter, more reserved, as if they were adjusting not just their posture but their perception of me in real time. Victor set his glass down slowly, the faint click against the table sounding louder than it should have. "Well," he said, forcing a small, controlled smile, "that certainly changes things." And it did, but not in the way he meant, not just professionally, but personally, because what had been exposed tonight was not just a misunderstanding, it was something deeper, something more permanent. Emily turned slightly toward him, as if looking for ground to stand on, but there was none left that felt stable, not after what had just unfolded. "I did not know," she said, almost to herself, and for a moment, I believed her, not because the truth was hidden, but because she had never thought it was worth asking, and that realization carried more weight than any accusation ever could. I let a brief silence settle before speaking again, not to press the moment, but to clarify it. "It was never a secret," I said, calm, measured. "It just was not something I needed to lead with." I glanced around the table, meeting a few eyes that now held a different kind of attention, not curiosity, but respect, the kind that comes when assumptions collapse under facts. "What matters is not where something starts," I continued. "It is what it becomes, and who stands by it before anyone else believes in it." And that landed, not loudly, but deeply, because everyone in that room understood what it takes to build something from nothing. Emily looked at me again, her expression no longer defensive, no longer confident, just uncertain. "So what happens now?" she asked, and that question was not about the company, not about the dinner, it was about us. About everything that had just been revealed between the lines. I held her gaze for a moment, steady, unhurried, and realized that the answer had already been forming long before tonight. This moment had just brought it into the open. "No," I said quietly. "We stop pretending we are on the same page." And the truth in that sentence settled heavier than anything else I had said all night. Her question lingered between us, fragile but unavoidable. And I could see the moment it truly landed, not just on her, but on everyone at the table, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding or a bad joke. This was about alignment, about values, about the quiet gap that had been growing between us long before tonight gave it a voice. Emily's eyes searched mine like she was looking for a way to rewind the last 10 minutes, to reshape them into something safer, something manageable. But there are moments in life that do not bend, and this was one of them. Victor shifted again, this time not speaking, just observing, because even he understood this was no longer a professional conversation, this was personal, and personal truths do not follow corporate rules. "Daniel," Emily said, her voice lower now, almost careful. "I did not mean it like that." And I believed that too, not because the words were harmless, but because intent rarely matches impact, and that is where the real damage lives. I gave a small nod, acknowledging her without softening what needed to be said. "I know," I replied, calm, steady. "But meaning does not erase what it reveals." And that sentence settled into the space between us like a line that could not be crossed back over. She looked down briefly, then back up, her composure returning in pieces. But not fully, not the way it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted, not just how she saw me, but how I saw her. And that difference changes everything. I reached for my jacket, draped neatly over the back of my chair, and stood up slowly, not abrupt, not dramatic, just deliberate, the kind of movement that signals closure without needing to announce it. A few people at the table instinctively straightened, as if the moment required it, and in a way, it did, because endings deserve acknowledgement. Even quiet ones. Emily stood as well, almost automatically, her eyes still fixed on me. "Are you leaving?" she asked, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there earlier, not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, maybe even a trace of concern. I met her gaze one last time, steady, clear, without anger, without hesitation. Yes, I said simply, because sometimes the most honest answers are the shortest ones. I paused for just a second, not to reconsider, but to let the reality of it settle, then added, just enough to make the truth unmistakable, you were right about one thing tonight, I said, my voice even, grounded. People do outgrow things. And I let that hang there, not as an insult, not as revenge, but as a statement, a reflection of what had just unfolded, and as I turned to walk away, I could feel it behind me, the silence, the weight, the beginning of karma taking its shape, not loud, not immediate, but inevitable. The sound of my footsteps against the polished floor felt louder than it should have, not because the room was empty, but because no one was speaking anymore, and that kind of silence follows you. It stretches, it lingers, it forces people to sit with what just happened instead of escaping it with laughter or small talk. I did not rush, did not look back, because I did not need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. But just before I reached the edge of the room, I heard it, my name, not loud, not desperate, just uncertain. Daniel, wait! Emily's voice, stripped of the sharpness it carried earlier, and for a brief second, I stopped, not turning yet, just standing there, letting that moment exist, because hesitation has a way of revealing more than confidence ever does. I could feel eyes shifting again, attention pulling back toward us, but this time it was different, not curiosity, not amusement, but something closer to realization. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze from across the space between us, and for the first time that night, she did not look like the woman who controlled every room she entered. She looked like someone trying to understand how quickly control can disappear. I did not know, she said again, softer now, and I could hear it, the weight behind those words, not as an excuse, but as a realization, and that is when karma becomes real, not when it punishes, but when it makes someone see clearly. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. That is the point, I replied, my voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach her without needing to rise. You did not know because you never thought it mattered enough to ask. And that truth landed deeper than anything else tonight, because it was not about the job, not about the company, it was about value, about what we choose to see in the people closest to us. The room stayed still, no one interrupting, no one daring to break the moment, because everyone understood. Now, this was not just a conversation, it was a shift, a consequence unfolding in real time. Emily took a small step forward, as if to close the distance, but stopped halfway, like she realized too late that some distances are not measured in feet, they are measured in moments like this, and I could see it in her eyes, that understanding settling in, quiet, unavoidable, the kind that does not fade when the night ends. And I held her gaze for one last second, not with anger, not with triumph, just clarity before turning again and walking out, leaving behind a room that would remember exactly where they were when everything changed. The night air outside felt different, cooler, quieter, like the world had not changed but I had, and as the door closed behind me, the noise of the room disappeared completely, replaced by something steady, something clear, the kind of silence that does not weigh on you but settles you. I walked a few steps down the sidewalk, the city lights stretching out in front of me, reflections of glass and steel built on foundations most people never see. And that thought stayed with me, because that is where everything starts, not in the spotlight, not in the applause, but in the work no one respects until it becomes something they cannot ignore. I paused for a moment, hands in my pockets, breathing in the cool air, and for the first time that night, there was no tension left, no need to explain, no need to prove anything, because truth does not follow you, it stays where it is and lets others catch up to it when they are ready. Somewhere behind me, inside that room, conversations were already changing, voices quieter, perspectives shifting, and I knew Emily would feel it, not all at once, but gradually, in the way people looked at her, in the way the story she told no longer held the same weight. That is how karma works, not loud, not immediate, but precise. It does not need to destroy anything, it just reveals what was always there. I took another step forward, then another, leaving the building behind me without looking back, because some chapters do not need a final glance, they end the moment you understand them, and as I walked into the night, one thought stayed with me: simple, steady, undeniable. Respect is not something you ask for, it is something people learn too late they should have given.